The torture taboo is, it's a number of things actually. The torture taboo represents, or the torture prohibition represents, the widespread international norms and laws that prohibit the practice of torture. Torture is one of the few practices in international society that is absolutely prohibited. Under no circumstances can a state engage in torture, whether they're at war, whether they're under a state of emergency, or whether their survival is at stake. It prohibits torture absolutely. The leading international prohibition on torture is the 1984 UN Convention Against Torture. It not only forces states to prohibit torture, it also forces states to carry out measures to prevent torture taking place, to prosecute offenders, but also to help torture survivors recover. But the torture taboo has another element, and this is where the taboo element comes in. Taboo here I refer to in the anthropological sense, used by scholars like Franz Steiner, Mary Douglas, and also by Nina Tannenwald when she talks about the nuclear taboo. Namely, the idea that a taboo is something associated with the sociology of danger. That is, you violate a particular norm, like the torture prohibition, and untold danger will come upon you. It'll release some sort of contagion effect. So, in this particular instance, when you violate the torture prohibition, not only does it harm the individual that you're torturing, it also harms the person who's doing the torture and the state that's doing the torture. It undermines their ethical standing in world politics. It undermines the ethical standing in the eyes of others. It undermines their identity as a humane, so-called civilized state in world politics. So the taboo is not only the widespread prohibition surrounding torture, it's also the link that is associated with the sociology of danger. In order to answer what the significance of the taboo is, you need to ask why torture is prohibited, why it is bad. It's only through here that we realise the importance of why the torture prohibition needs to be protected. So to engage in torture is, to quote Henry Shue, is an attack on the defenceless. When you have a victim in your custody and you torture them, they are completely defenceless. They cannot fight back, they cannot defend themselves. They are completely at the mercy of their torturer. The torturer can do with them whatever they wish. That is a horrifying scenario. But torture also forces the victim to collude against themselves. Because torture undermines the dignity of the victim or the survivor, when a torturer uses torture against someone, they are undermining their dignity and then using it against themselves to undermine their very fabric. And I talk about this in my book, where I look at how the torture taboo needs to be protected and why it is so significant, because not only does it attack the defenceless, not only does it force us to collude against ourselves, but it's an excess use of pain, an unnecessary use of pain that destroys what it means to be a human being. So it destroys us in a couple of ways. One, it undermines our will. Our will is what allows us to act in the world. It provides us with agency. Torture destroys that. But it also destroys our personality. Our personality is something that everyone shares, but it's also something that is completely unique to each and every one of us. So when torture is used, it not only destroys our ability to act in the world, it also destroys who we are. It destroys what it means to be a human being. And so this is why it's significant, and this is why it needs to be protected. Trump's public support for torture historically within the US is actually quite unusual. Usually, the US has either used torture in the past, whether that be in Vietnam, it used torture at the turn of the 20th century in the Philippines, and it's also supported states, third world countries, developing countries, authoritarian regimes in using torture around the world. But what is interesting is that in all these situations, the United States took a lot of effort to hide the torture, to deny it. And in the Bush administration, to redefine it as something else, as enhanced interrogation techniques. So what was interesting about the Bush administration was that they never called what they did torture. They always called it something else. In fact, they even came out and supported the absolute prohibition against torture because they knew that what they were doing, or they knew that torture was wrong. And so they knew they couldn't publicly justify the use of torture without getting blowback, without getting public criticism, without undermining their ethical standing in the world, without undermining their soft power or their identity. So they redefined it as something else, as enhanced interrogation techniques. But they also outsourced it to other countries, whether that be Pakistan, whether that be Morocco, whether that be Egypt. They outsourced the use of torture to authoritarian regimes to enable them to carry out techniques that were prohibited under US law. And so what's interesting with the US use of torture, which is reflective of the the use of torture broadly and globally, is that torture is always hidden, denied, redefined as something else, outsourced. States use techniques techniques of torture that don't leave any marks, to hide the fact torture has taken place. This shows that despite the fact that the US and other governments around the world have violated the torture taboo still matters because it still has an impact on states. They know what they're doing is wrong, and that's why they hide it, that's why they redefine it. And we saw that under Bush, and that's why Trump is so unusual in that he publicly came out and supported it. So Trump's public support on torture has had, not only is it reckless and illegal, but it has had huge negative implications for the torture prohibition. On the one hand, it undermines the torture prohibition. By merely saying that torture should be used is saying that the absolute prohibition against torture should be revised. That currently the absolute prohibition against torture is not adequate, that it is inconvenient, and that we need to revise it. That's dangerous because it doesn't need revision. You've had intelligence and former law enforcement officials come out and condemn the use of torture because they know it doesn't work. Rapport building is a lot more useful. Secondly, it sends out a pretty strong signal to the rest of the world that torture is okay. The thing about the Bush administration's use of torture was that they never said torture was okay. Trump, on the other hand, has. So that sends a powerful signal to authoritarian regimes around the world that the United States isn't going to call them up when they use torture, that the United States is going to turn a blind eye when they use torture, and it could, in fact, encourage use of torture widely around the world. Thirdly, it shows a clear lack of leadership in upholding human rights. Not only is Trump the President of the United States, but because the United States is the last remaining global superpower, it also has an obligation to uphold international order and the international legal system. By coming out and advocating the use of torture, it's sending a pretty clear signal, again, that not only is torture okay, but it shows a clear lack of leadership, that it's okay for people in the United States to advocate torture. It's okay to talk about using torture. It's okay to torture someone. This shows a clear lack of leadership. And it was quite reckless for him to engage in this form of behaviour. The positive that has come out of this is that Trump has received widespread condemnation. There is a movement within the administration to not use torture, which was led, I believe, by Secretary of Defence Mattis, who said that torture doesn't work and he wouldn't be using it. And he's put a brick wall up, basically, that torture will not be used under a Trump administration. Hopefully that stands. But the fact that Trump was not able to get away with using torture, the fact that he received so much condemnation, and the fact there were so many barriers to introducing it, shows that a lot of people still think that the torture prohibition is something worthwhile, something worth protecting and is valuable. And so we should still be wary, we should still be on guard, but the positive is that there are institutional barriers in the way that can, in the short term at least, prevent Trump from using torture in the future.